sandstone cliffs of the American Southwest, tucked into natural alcoves hundreds of feet above canyon floors, sit the remains of entire cities, multi-story stone apartment complexes, ceremonial chambers, storage rooms built with extraordinary skill into some of the most dramatic and seemingly inhospitable terrain in North America. For centuries, these places were home to a thriving, sophisticated civilization. And then, within the span of roughly one generation, in the late 13th century, the people who built them left and never came back. Today, we're exploring the mystery of the Ancestral Puebloans. Once widely known by the Navajo term Anasazi, the builders of Mesa, Verde, and Chaco Canyon, the severe multi-decade drought that historians believe drove them from their homes, and the darker, more unsettling thread of evidence that some archaeologists believe points to violence and social breakdown in the civilization's final, desperate years. Before we go further, it's worth pausing on names because this matters, and because it tells us something important right from the start. The term Anasazi, which many people still associate with this civilization thanks to decades of earlier popular usage, actually comes from a Navajo word that roughly translates to something like ancient enemies, or ancestors of our enemies. It wasn't a name the civilization used for themselves, and it's a term that many of their actual living descendants, the modern Puebloan peoples of the American Southwest, including the Hopi, Zuni, and the various Pueblo nations of New Mexico, understandably find inappropriate given both its origin and its meaning. Today, most archaeologists and historians have shifted toward using the term Ancestral Puebloans instead, a term that more accurately and more respectfully reflects the direct, continuous cultural and ancestral relationship between this ancient civilization and the Puebloan peoples living in the American Southwest today. People whose communities and cultural traditions represent a genuine, unbroken continuation of the same civilization, not a vanished, mysterious people who disappeared without a trace. That distinction turns out to be genuinely important for understanding this entire story correctly. Because unlike some of the more dramatic popular narratives you might have encountered, this isn't really a story about a civilization that mysteriously vanished into thin air. It's a story about a civilization that underwent a massive, wrenching, difficult transformation and relocation. One whose descendants are very much still here, still practicing traditions with deep roots reaching back to exactly the cliff cities and canyon settlements we're about to explore. Let's start with who the Ancestral Puebloans were, and just how impressive their civilization actually became. The Ancestral Puebloan culture developed across the Four Corners region of the American Southwest, the area where the modern states of Arizona, New Mexico, Colorado, and Utah all meet, beginning roughly around the 1st century CE, and reaching its most sophisticated, architecturally impressive peak between roughly 900 and 1300 CE. Two sites in particular stand out as the most remarkable achievements of the civilization, and they represent, interestingly, two quite different phases and approaches to ancestral Puebloan settlement. The first is Chaco Canyon, located in present-day northwestern New Mexico, which flourished as a major political, economic, and ceremonial center roughly between 850 and 1150 CE. Chaco Canyon featured a series of massive, multi-story stone structures called great houses, the largest of which, Pueblo Bonito, contained an estimated 600 rooms across up to 5 stories in height, making it, at the time of its construction, one of the largest buildings anywhere in North America, a record it would hold for centuries, not surpassed in scale until the construction of large apartment buildings in cities like New York many centuries later. Chaco Canyon's significance extended well beyond its architecture. Archaeological evidence reveals an extensive network of perfectly straight roads radiating outward from the canyon, some stretching for many miles across the surrounding landscape, connecting Chaco to dozens of smaller outlying communities across a huge portion of the way to Four Corners region. Researchers have also documented evidence of sophisticated astronomical alignments built directly into Chacoan architecture, with certain structures and windows precisely oriented to track solstices, equinoxes, and even more complex, longer-term lunar cycles, evidence of detailed, long-term astronomical observation, and genuinely impressive architectural engineering knowledge. Excavations at Chaco have also uncovered goods originating from remarkably distant regions, including turquoise, seashells from the Pacific coast, and evidence of chocolate residue found in ceramic vessels. Chocolate that could only have originated from cacao grown far to the south in Mesoamerica, indicating that Chaco Canyon sat at the center of trade and cultural exchange networks extending hundreds, even thousands, of miles across the broader region. The second major site, and the one perhaps most instantly recognizable in popular imagination, is Mesa Verde, located in present-day southwestern Colorado, home to some of the most extraordinary and visually striking cliff dwellings anywhere in the world. Beginning particularly in the 12th and 13th centuries, communities living in this region began constructing elaborate multi-story stone villages built directly into large natural alcoves carved into sandstone cliff faces. Dramatic structures like Cliff Palace, the largest cliff dwelling in North America, containing an estimated 150 rooms and over 20 ceremonial chambers called kivas, all built into a single massive natural rock alcove, accessible only via a network of hand and toe holds carved directly into the sheer sandstone cliff face, or via wooden ladders that could be pulled up for defensive purposes when needed. These cliff dwellings represent remarkable engineering and architectural achievement, precisely fitted stonework constructed in extraordinarily challenging vertical terrain. But they also raise an interesting question in their own right. Why did ancestral Puebloan communities, after centuries of building primarily on canyon floors and mesa tops, shift so dramatically toward building in these dramatic, difficult-to-access cliff locations during this specific later period? Many researchers believe this architectural shift itself may be an early clue pointing toward growing instability and insecurity within the region during the 12th and 13th centuries, with communities increasingly prioritizing defensible, easily protected locations. A detail that becomes particularly significant once we look closely at what was happening across the wider region during exactly this same period. So now, we arrive at the central mystery. Sometime around 1300 CE, within a remarkably short window of time, roughly the span of a single generation, the ancestral Puebloan population across the entire Four Corners region underwent a massive, sweeping migration, essentially abandoning the great cliff dwellings, the massive Chacan great houses, and the broader settlement pattern that had defined the civilization for centuries, relocating southward and eastward toward the Rio Grande Valley and other regions where their direct descendants, the modern Pueblo peoples, continue to live today. The primary, most well-supported explanation for this dramatic migration centers on climate, specifically an extended, severe drought event that tree ring research, meaning dendrochronological research analyzing growth patterns preserved in ancient wood samples, has allowed researchers to document with remarkable precision. This evidence points to what's often called the Great Drought of the late 13th century, a period of dramatically reduced rainfall lasting from approximately 1276 to 1299 CE. Nearly a full quarter century of significantly below average precipitation across the entire Four Corners region for a civilization whose sophisticated agricultural systems depended heavily on relatively reliable seasonal rainfall to grow corn, beans, and squash in an already arid, marginal environment. A drought lasting nearly 25 consecutive years would have been genuinely catastrophic, far beyond the range of shorter-term dry spells that ancestral Puebloan farmers had likely developed effective strategies to manage across previous generations. Tree ring data from this period shows consistently narrow growth rings across an enormous span of years, physical evidence of a landscape under sustained, severe environmental stress. Precisely the kind of prolonged agricultural crisis that could plausibly force entire communities to abandon home territories that could simply no longer reliably sustain them. But, and this is a pattern that should sound very familiar by now if you've been following these kinds of historical mysteries with us, severe drought alone likely doesn't tell the complete story. Several additional compounding factors appear to have contributed to this crisis, layering additional severe stress onto communities already struggling with catastrophic agricultural failure. One significant factor involves environmental degradation resulting from centuries of intensive settlement and resource use in a genuinely fragile, marginal desert environment. Supporting the substantial populations that had lived across this region for centuries required extensive agricultural land use, along with significant deforestation for construction, timber, and fuel. Some researchers propose that this long-term environmental strain, similar to patterns we've seen in other collapse stories, From Cahokia's deforestation pressures to the Maya's agricultural overextension, may have gradually reduced the landscape's overall resilience and carrying capacity, leaving communities considerably more vulnerable when that severe multi-decade drought eventually struck, compared to how the same communities might have weathered similar conditions centuries earlier, before generations of intensive land use had already strained the surrounding environment. Another significant factor involves increasing social and political tension likely arising from resource scarcity itself. And this is where we arrive at the more genuinely unsettling and more scientifically debated thread of evidence in this particular story. As agricultural failure intensified and food resources grew increasingly scarce across the region during the height of the Great Drought, archaeological evidence from several specific sites suggests this period was marked by rising violence, conflict between different communities, and, according to a body of research that remains genuinely debated and discussed carefully within the archaeological community, disturbing evidence at a small number of specific sites that some researchers interpret as indicating instances of cannibalism. It's important to present this particular thread of evidence with real care and appropriate scientific context, because it remains a genuinely debated area of archaeological interpretation, not a settled, universally agreed upon conclusion. The evidence in question primarily comes from analysis of human skeletal remains found at a handful of specific sites within the broader Ancestral Puebloan cultural region, remains that some researchers have identified as showing patterns of processing, including cut marks, burning, and bone breakage patterns, that they argue are consistent with practices associated with cannibalism in other documented archaeological and ethnographic contexts around the world. And in a smaller number of especially debated cases, some researchers have pointed to chemical residue evidence found on associated cooking vessels that they interpret as potentially consistent with the processing of human tissue. Other archaeologists and researchers have offered alternative interpretations for at least some of this same evidence, including possible ritual mortuary practices unrelated to nutritional cannibalism, the desecration of the remains of perceived witches or enemies as a form of extreme social punishment or warfare-related violence, documented in various forms across numerous different cultures throughout world history, and taphonomic factors, meaning natural processes affecting how bones decompose and become damaged over centuries, that could potentially explain at least some of the observed skeletal damage patterns, without necessarily indicating cannibalism specifically. This remains a genuinely active, carefully argued area of ongoing archaeological research and debate, and it's discussed here not for shock value, but because it represents a genuine and scientifically significant thread of evidence that many researchers believe reflects the severe social breakdown, extreme resource scarcity, and interpersonal violence that likely characterized at least some communities during the most desperate final years of this prolonged environmental and social crisis. Whatever the precise nature and full explanation of that specific evidence ultimately turns out to be, what this evidence collectively suggests, taken as a whole, is that the final decades before the Great Regional Migration were likely characterized by severe, genuinely traumatic social stress, not simply a calm, orderly, gradual relocation in response to worsening farming conditions, but a period marked by real desperation, real conflict, and significant social upheaval, as communities across the region grappled with a multi-decade environmental catastrophe that was fundamentally undermining the agricultural foundation their entire way of life had depended upon for centuries. Faced with this convergence of severe, sustained drought, degraded agricultural land, and escalating social conflict and violence, communities across the Four Corners region made the difficult decision, likely playing out through countless individual and community choices across many years rather than one single coordinated migration, to abandon the cliff dwellings, the great houses, and the broader settlement region that had been home to their civilization for centuries, relocating toward the Rio Grande Valley in New Mexico and other regions to the south and east, areas that offered more reliable water sources, including major perennial rivers less vulnerable to the kind of catastrophic multi-decade drought that had devastated the Four Corners region specifically. And this is where the true and genuinely important ending of this story differs so significantly from the more sensationalized vanished civilization narrative that unfortunately still circulates in some popular media. The ancestral Puebloan people did not disappear. They migrated, adapted, and rebuilt, establishing new communities along the Rio Grande and in other regions of the Southwest. Communities that grew into the various Pueblo nations that continue to thrive today, including Acoma, Zuni, and the numerous Pueblo communities of the Rio Grande Valley in New Mexico, alongside the Hopi communities of northern Arizona, all of whom maintain genuine, documented cultural, linguistic, and in many cases, direct ancestral continuity, connecting them to the very civilization that built Chaco Canyon. And Mesa Verde centuries earlier, modern Pueblo peoples today maintain deep oral traditions and cultural knowledge regarding their ancestors, migration from these ancestral homelands. And many Pueblo communities continue to hold Chaco Canyon, Mesa Verde, and other related sites as deeply significant. Sacred ancestral places actively involved in the ongoing archaeological research, preservation, and interpretation of these sites today, ensuring that the story of the Ancestral Puebloans is told, increasingly, in genuine partnership and consultation with the very descendant communities whose direct cultural heritage these remarkable places represent. A meaningfully different and more respectful approach than the way many of these sites were studied and popularly presented in earlier generations of American archaeology and popular media. What makes the story of the Ancestral Puebloans so genuinely compelling when placed alongside these other great historical collapse stories we've explored is this particular combination of extraordinary architectural achievement, genuine environmental catastrophe on a scale that pushed an entire regional civilization to its absolute limits, real evidence of social breakdown and desperate violence in the crisis's final, hardest years, and yet ultimately a story of survival, adaptation, and genuine cultural continuity, rather than the complete, mysterious disappearance popular imagination has sometimes assigned to it. The cliff dwellings and great houses left standing empty across the Four Corners region aren't really the abandoned ruins of a vanished, mysterious people. They're the ancestral homeland of communities who faced one of the most severe, sustained environmental catastrophes in North American history, and who responded, ultimately, not by disappearing, but by moving, adapting, rebuilding, and carrying their culture, their knowledge, and their traditions forward into communities that stand and thrive in the American Southwest to this very day.